This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 16th, 1962, Walter Cronkite succeeded Douglas Edwards as the anchorman of CBS's nightly feature newscast, which was tentatively named Walter Cronkite with the News and then later became the CBS Evening News. Which, by the way, that's a little bit of a weird one, where you start with your name on the show and then they take it off, even though you become the most trusted news person in America. And that is the truth. Cronkite became not just the voice of CBS, but he became in many ways the voice of America. So much so that 6 years later, LBJ, when faced with eroding popularity and the Vietnam War spiraling out of control, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." So let's talk about Cronkite's role in shaping the political life of this country. No surprise, he weaves in and out of basically all the major stories from the 60s through the 70s and into the 80s and beyond. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We will talk about how maybe there is no equivalent right now. I mean, it's very clear there's no equivalent right now. And what does that say about our current culture? But none of us, I don't think, watched Walter Cronkite, but I definitely sort of had him looming in my imagination in this role. I'm just curious, kind of just like even growing up. So what is it that you think of when you hear his name?
I mean, that sobriquet, the most trusted name in news, or the most trusted man in news, or the most trusted man in America, all of that is what you think of when you think of Walter Cronkite, because that's the little tidbit that you hear growing up. It's that you sort of like get from the ether, because none of us was alive and watching news when Walter Cronkite was on air. But that sort of legacy and that glow around him continued on well past the time. And I think probably even more so as news got more contentious and less trusted, Cronkite became even more of an almost mythical figure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he, to me, is the quintessential anchorman. Like when you think about and when I think about Anchorman the movie, I think about like the comedy stick of it. But like in terms of seriousness, in terms of like how people sort of model themselves after, I think he provided this sort of like, I don't know, and I don't want to say caricature because I think he's very authentic and that's why he's so trusted. But he has created this sort of persona that people have tried to, I think, either mimic or imitate or aspire to. That is, we don't have anyone like him today. The closest I could say is Dan Rather, because that's his, sort of the person who succeeded him. But that's it.
Yeah, and I we'll talk about this later. I don't think it's possible for anybody to play this role anymore. But that idea that Cronkite was synonymous with this era of trusted and objective news. And I think it's so interesting, Kellie, the point that you made is the moments that we remember him for most are not moments when he was sort of like reading the news like a robot.
Yes.
It was when he was not just being emotional, but also editorializing. Like those are the big Cronkite moments. And yet he has become, I think, in the popular imagination, synonymous not just with trusted, but with impartial and unemotional and sort of like unbiased view from nowhere sort of news.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll circle back to that stuff because I do think that's the central question is kind of how much was he and the trust that people had in him just a product of the structures of the time, basically 3 channels. So whoever's on TV is going to seem super trusted. Or, is there something within Cronkite himself that feels unique? I mean, he's clearly very talented. He rose to the top of the industry. And so let's talk a little bit about where he comes from. He's born in Missouri. His family then moves to Texas. He's a journalism kind of catches the journalism bug pretty early on as a high school student, and then he goes and joins the United Press in the 30s. He is the first one to be referred to as an anchorman in the 50s, and he covers the RNC and the DNC in 52. Then it's really in the early 60s things really start to take off. I mean, do we want to jump all the way to the Kennedy assassination? Is that the first moment where he really owns it? Is there anything prior to that sticks out for you?
Well, one thing that I would say that is worth noting as we get to the Kennedy era are something that you mentioned and then something else that's happening in 63. First of all, the show goes from 15 minutes to 30 minutes, and he becomes the anchor of that 30-minute broadcast that becomes, again, like synonymous with television news. The idea that you turn on the TV, you watch it for a half an hour, you get this information from this person who carries the label anchorman. That feels very important because he becomes synonymous with like the format. And I think that all of that is kind of in place as the Kennedy assassination is breaking, just a couple of months after the expansion of the show to 30 minutes.
Yeah. And JFK is like one of the first featured guests on the show, which I think establishes him immediately as this is a person who will be in conversation with presidents. This is a person who will give you sort of like the most breaking important news of your day. And I think people not just associated him with CBS, but like associated him with their evening routine. Like this is something that we have dinner or right before dinner or right after dinner. We're listening to Cronkite.
Well, and it's interesting the sort of symbiosis with the Kennedys because it pushes him, I think, I don't think anyone looked at Walter Cronkite and said, like, you're cool. But it pushes him out of just, like, covering politics to this sort of nexus of, like, political and cultural life. And I think your point, Kellie, about it being a routine, I mean, it just feels like, in whatever way, people connected with him, not just as he's going to read really straightforward copy, but more he's going to kind of connect with our full lives and walk us through these big moments. So I think his reaction when Kennedy is assassinated, what stands out is not just that he delivered the news, but that he showed some emotion and he showed some humanity in that moment.
There's this moment right after he announces that President Kennedy has died where he takes off his glasses and he wipes his eyes.
Yeah.
And that, I think, that he stood in that moment as an avatar for a nation entering this process of grieving. And again, like it's not that he read the straight copy. It's that he showed emotion in an emotional moment.
And can I say for like the era of TV when people are watching more and more and TVs are becoming more a part of people's sort of like routine, he's not, interestingly enough, he's not Hollywood. Like, he's not this, like, John Hamm kind of, good-looking guy that comes on the screen. He's like, and that's I'm not trying to shade like, his attractiveness. But I mean, like, he's not that shiny personality type. And I think that's what makes him so attractive or enduring. It's that, okay, this guy is smart and like me in some way.
Yeah. I just love that John Hamm is your stand-in for like really attractive mid-century white guys.
It's Mad Men.
If you went to ChatGPT and put in a picture of Walter Cronkite and said, make this person 30% more attractive, John Hamm would come out.
Yes.
So there you go.
That's who would certainly have to play him.
An interesting thing about that day, November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy's assassination, earlier in that day, there had been a 4-minute story about the Beatles' arrival in the United States. The first introduction of the Beatles on CBS was set to air that night, and then it got bumped because of the Kennedy assassination, and then it eventually aired on December 10th. So let's move on a little bit through his career. I mean, one thing that just jumps out to me about his like unflappability, and it's funny. I mean, people think of him as unflappable, but I think, as we're pointing out, a lot of times it's his flappability that makes people really connected to him. But he had this nickname. Well, so he was referred to as Uncle Walter, I think, which gets at a lot of what we're saying here. But he had this other nickname that was apparently Old Iron Pants for his grace under pressure, which is just a terrible
That's a horrible name.
Terrible
it really
nickname.
is. Like,
I also don't understand how like iron pants make you strong under pressure. Maybe it's a scuba diving thing. Maybe it's more.
I don't even. I'm trying to come up with like ways to rationalize.
Don't think about it too hard. Because I don't think we have an explicit rating.
During the moon landing, by this point, his is by far the most popular TV show, 1969. Nearly 2 out of 3 American homes are tuned into CBS to hear Cronkite report on those events. And then it keeps going all the way into the 60s and 70s. I think of the 68 conventions, and Cronkite have a huge role there. And then,
King's assassination.
Yep.
Tet Offensive.
And you get to this point, right? And I think this is the other, I think, key point is that his willingness to put his feet down and, talk about what was happening in Vietnam and really sort of see it for what it was. By that point, I suppose he'd had the trust in order to be able to take a stand in that way. But I think it also shows that he wasn't just reading the reports that were coming in. He was really seeing the conflict for what it was and seeing how it was spiraling and the way it was, to the point where, as I said in the intro, LBJ kind of recognized that, well, when Cronkite is seeing that this is a fiasco, that means something.
You're in deep trouble.
Right.
Pretty much you're in deep trouble to win back hearts and minds, for sure.
And it's hard to say whether he was leading or following, but it's at that same point in time when public sentiment really turns against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So he's like right there at the moment, again, giving voice to a sentiment that exists in the country and shaping the news in that way. Because the other thing that stands out for me about Cronkite, the other moment, is the Iran hostage crisis in 79 and 80. He's the one who makes the decision to put on the bottom of the screen, the hostages. That's day 51, day 89, day 400 of the hostages being held in Iran. And that is both informing the American people, but it is an editorial decision about what people need to know. It keeps the hostage crisis front and center, and that has an effect on the 1980 election. I mean, it has consequences when he makes these decisions.
Yeah. I even think about when it comes to like exciting coverage, like the moon landing. And there's a quote of him sort of like rubbing his hands together as he's like watching the footage as well and saying like, whew, boy. Like, it's
excited.
intense. Yeah, it's like they are landing on the moon. Like, and to see that, like, that kind of breaking character a little bit, like, even Cronkite can't help but sort of like exhale when thinking about the moon landing is something that is memorable.
Hey there, Jody here, and I'm excited to tell you that one of our favorite Radiotopia siblings, Ear Hustle, is back with a brand new season. This is their 13th season, and the show just keeps getting better. Now, I don't know if you know, but Ear Hustle is the show about life inside prison, but it is not your typical prison podcast. Co-hosts Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods have recently been spending time at 4 California prisons, and now they have a season's worth of funny, surprising, and unforgettable stories to share. In a recent episode, they were able to visit a groundbreaking prison hospice where they spoke to men who are grappling with the reality of dying inside prison. Also coming up this season are stories about the objects people keep inside their prison cells, complicated mom-daughter relationships inside prison, and stories of incarcerated people who wonder whether they've become too comfortable behind bars. These are stories about life on the inside told by those who live it. I'll be listening, and I hope you will too. Find Ear Hustle wherever you get your podcasts. Yeah, I mean, this conversation we're having here and this framing of him, I mean, it actually makes me look at his phrase that he ended every broadcast with, and that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. He wasn't saying, and that's what happened. Maybe I'm overreading this, but he wasn't saying, and that's what happened today. He's saying, and that's the way it is. Like, there is I'm giving you a take. Yep. I'm framing it for you. I'm sort of trying to get to some truth that is not just a ticker of event.
That's the equivalent of to me. It's because I say this all the time. It is what it is.
Right.
It is what it is. That to me is just like there's no messing around. There's no adding to. There's no extra color. Just is what it is.
Yeah.
And that kind of, I think, encapsulates so much of the feeling that Americans have about whether it's politics or pandemic or child rearing, whatever it is.
I don't think you're overreading it at all, Jody. I mean, I think that one of the reasons Cronkite is so trusted, one of the reasons this period in news is so exceptional, is because there is this sense that there both should be and is a national consensus. Mm-hmm. And these men who anchor the evening news are giving you the the viewpoint of the news, or like just like the things that they are saying are the way that the world is. And there's obviously a lot that gets missed in that. There is a lot that is filtered out in that process. But that idea that like at the end of the newscast you say, and that's the way it is just reinforcing this sort of central voice speaking for the country, that the anchors of the evening news in this period, that's the role that they played. And I think that sign off captures it so perfectly.
I mean, when LBJ says, I've lost middle America, I mean, obviously it's like, well, what do you mean by middle America? And so I think, yes, we have to acknowledge that there are probably a lot of voices. There are a lot of voices that were crowded out by the fact that there were only 3 or 4 networks, and Cronkite was one of just a few, and they were all white men who were delivering this news. But, as we start to think about now, and this obvious question of why is there no one as trusted, period, as Walter Cronkite. Certainly no one in journalism comes even close at this point. I do go back to this question of whether it is something about him or something just about the structure, and that when you do have a moment where there's only 3 or 4 voices kind of convening 80% of the conversation, you get trust because you kind of don't have any other options, right? And now there's a lot of places for people to both find their own truth and, manufacture their own reality. And so I think a lot of it is just how fractured things have become structurally, not just this old saw that, there aren't any trustworthy newsmen anymore. I mean, I think if you put up, let me put it this way, if Anderson Cooper or Chris Cuomo, who's, whatever, who's dicey, right? But if he got teleported back and sat in that chair, I'd suspect he would be seen as just as trustworthy, right?
I think so. And I think that actually Anderson Cooper is a great example of how different the media news landscape is. Like the way that Cooper came to the sort of forefront of the national awareness was in his coverage of Katrina. His willingness to speak truth to power, to be like, where is the government? Why is nobody here helping? But then he immediately pivots to kind of like almost like a Bravo personality, right? Because that's what keeps people watching in a very, not just like more fractured news environment, although it is absolutely that, but in a more entertainment driven one. And this is something that Cronkite even talked about as he was getting toward the end of his career and after he retired, is like, if you're going to make news a profit driver, we are screwed, because like we are going to be selling you news entertainment instead of reporting the news. And as problematic as that was as a framework in that period, it's a big difference between how news functions now.
It's so funny to me because there's an article about like who is the most trusted voice in America now, and like they're listing, a bunch of people like Oprah and Tom Hanks, Dolly Parton, Fauci, Michelle
Not
Obama.
Fauci.
Yeah, I know. It's like, it's all these people, the Bill and Melinda Gates, there's Warren Buffett. And I'm looking at this list of people and I'm like, no. Like, I do love Dolly, but she's not reporting the news. Do you know what I mean? Like,
these aren't news people.
They're
billionaires.
Sure, I love Tom Hanks, but listen, you're not doing the news either, bro.
No.
And I would argue, moreover, that the moment they were, if any of those people, the moment they decide to touch news or politics, their trust would get undermined, right?
Which is like what you said about Fauci, right? Like
exactly.
Because he had power to influence what people thought about the pandemic, he became enemy number one for a sizable contingent in the country.
So, Cronkite by the mid-70s, poll after poll are showing him as the most trusted person in the country. I think it's interesting. I went and tried as well, Kellie, to find like that same polling now. I think people have just stopped polling that question because I don't think it's just a valid question in the year 2024. Right. Like there's no one who there's a consensus trust. I mean, we actually think Dolly Parton might be the closest.
I know. And what does that say about the state of America, that a country singer is the person that we trust the most?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to belabor this too long because I wrote a whole book about it. But that is the end result, not of a set of natural processes, but there was a concerted campaign to fracture people's trust in news media. And there were certainly journalists who helped that along. Yeah. And there were certainly problems in the news that helped that along. But this was a deliberate effort to lead people away from their trust in the news and replace it with something else. And I think that's worth pointing out.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. That is our look at Walter Cronkite ascending in 1962 and a little bit of his legacy. He, of course, keeps popping up over and over through many stories, including, that moment. The last time we mentioned Cronkite on the show was actually he did that phone-in thing with Jimmy Carter. Remember that tidbit about how they were like, well, yeah, and we wouldn't trust regular Americans to call in and just talk to Jimmy Carter and keep their cool, but we know that if Walter Cronkite is sitting there, they're going to behave themselves. So there you go.
They respect Walter.
Yes.
Uncle Walt.
Yes.
Uncle Walt. Old iron pants. All right. Some also on this day's other things that happened on April 16th. In 1789, this is when President-elect George Washington leaves Mount Vernon, Virginia for his inauguration in New York to take place on April 30th. So that is, among other things, the days in which you need to take upwards of 2 weeks to get from Central Virginia to New York City.
And in 1945, his first speech to Congress, President Harry S. Truman pledged to carry out the war and peace policies of his late predecessor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Right. This would have been right after Roosevelt died.
Yeah.
And we did that episode recently about Truman and Truman's popularity. And, it's funny. I was thinking about that episode, and we ended it by talking a little bit about how it's surprising that Truman is pretty high up there on those lists of popular presidents. But of course, he oversaw the dropping of the bombs in the end of the war. And I think at some level that is just, he's seen as the one who won the war. So there you go.
Right. And it was also on this day in 1963 that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he responded to a group of local white clergymen who had criticized him for leading street protests. This is where King writes the quite famous line, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
We've done an episode on the letter from Birmingham jail. I think that was with Jamel Bowie, and a kind of close reading of that, and a sort of a look, as with much of King, about how a lot of the stuff in that letter gets cherry-picked and taken out of context. But if you actually sit and read it, you kind of get a picture of King that you don't necessarily get elsewhere. But we will leave it there. Reminder that we are talking about all this stuff and doing some more analysis week by week in our newsletter. So you can go sign up for that. You'll get a dose of 10 or 12 interesting things that happen throughout the week, plus some original analysis that maybe tries to tie them all together. You can sign up for our newsletter at thisdaypod.com. All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News. For me, it's a moment for which I long have planned, but which nevertheless comes with some sadness. I'll be back from time to time with special news reports and documentaries. Old anchormen, you see, don't fade away. They just keep coming back for more. And that's the way it is. Friday, March 6th, 1981. Dan Rather will be sitting in here for the next few years. Good night.
Radiotopia.